this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. We're going to be making a lot more videos on chess openings and lines that people have requested. So today we're going to be looking at the Moscow variation, very popular line in the Sicilian defense that a lot of players just are not sure how to play correctly. So we're going to look at some of the main variations, some key concepts to think about if you are playing the Sicilian defense and someone plays the Moscow variation. If you're not familiar with it, it starts out with pawn to e4, pawn c5, this is the Sicilian defense, knight to f3, pawn to d6, and then bishop to b5, putting black in check. Now there's three ways that black can respond. I'm just going to ignore the fact that black can play queen to d7. You have the knight coming up here to c6. You have the knight coming to d7, and you have the bishop coming here to d7 as well. A lot of people have a lot of opinions about which move is best. I think all three moves are completely fine. Each of them has their own unique style to them. I think for many players, it's really going to be up to you, depending on how you like to play a game of chess, what your strengths and weaknesses are, and then the tendencies of your opponent, because there's a lot of mistakes that white can make in each variation. So we are going to look at the three moves today and go over some pros and cons for each of them. The first variation we are going to look at is knight to d7. A lot of players like this because they don't want to give white the option to take their knight and then have double pawns on the c-file, and they don't want to give up their bishop, even if it's in exchange for white's own bishop. So they play knight to d7. White rarely is going to take the knight, but if they do, just go ahead and take back with your bishop. Don't take with your queen. It's a little awkward, tough to get the light square bishop involved into the action now because the queen is blocking it, and then you're going to have to push this pawn just to get involved. Go ahead and take with your bishop. Now the bishop can easily get involved. Queen to c7 or b6, depending on what your opponent does, is going to be a great option for that queen. So white does have some other options you will see. One of the most common is going to be pawn to d4, pushing in the center of the board. And black has three main options from here, and I'll go over a few of them and why I like them or don't like them. One that you'll see black make a lot, not the recommended move for me, is to go ahead and take with the pawn here on d4. The reason I don't like it as much, I'm not saying it's a terrible move, but white can take with the queen, just has a very active position. Normally you would like to see something like pawn to e5, but now there's a backward pawn here on d6. Very easy for white to attack this. Black really wants his knight here on b8, so he can play up here to c6, pushing the queen back. No, just great option, and the queen is just putting so much pressure on black. You can see all this material for white getting very aggressive, where black's just kind of sitting here with his knight pinned down to his king, trying to figure out how he is going to develop his material. So not necessarily my favorite. Another option black has is to force the action on this bishop. So pawn to a6. And now if white wants to go ahead and take, hey, that's completely fine. Black can recapture, doesn't have to worry about as much pressure right now, and then can continue in the game. Maybe the pawn takes. Now if the pawn takes, play queen up here to a5. Don't take with the pawn right away. This is check. Now if we see the knight come down here to c3, blocking this, the queen can come over and take, solidifying the pawn chain still in the center of the board, not giving up any of the center pawn. So this is going to be fine for black. Maybe bishop to e3, queen up here to c4, queen d2. This is going to be a fine variation for black. Now if we come back to this position, white might not take this knight here on d7, could easily come back to c4, and in this case I would just push forward with the pawns, pawn to b5, forcing the bishop to move. If he comes to d5, just play rook to b8. This is fine. Maybe castle on the king side, knight to f6, attacking this bishop right here. Sometimes you'll have someone who's not very familiar with the position, and after pawn to a6, they'll just come back to a4. because they've maybe played the right Lopez and they're just used to coming back here to a4. But this would be a huge mistake. You can probably see it already. Pawn to b5, forcing the bishop to move. But after here, pawn to c4, that bishop is going to fall. So black's going to be up in material after that exchange. Now if we come back, maybe instead of pawn to a6, black wants to try something else. And then could just play knight to f6. I think this is a fine variation as well. You could see white just take the pawn right here on c5. This is another spot where I wouldn't take with the pawn. I would play queen up here to a5. And this is even better than the position we just looked at because the knight on f6 is attacking this pawn on e4. Why is that important? This is check. It's also attacking the bishop here on b5. So usually white should be playing knight to c3. If he doesn't, this bishop is going to fall. But now black can play knight takes on e4, gobbling up a center pawn, and the knight can't move because it is pinned down to this queen. So maybe queen to d3 attacking the knight, but then the knight can come back and take that pawn on c5. So this is a really good variation for black if you're looking to what to do when your opponent plays that pawn to d4. Now, they're not always going to go to d4. Another option would be to come to c3, knowing that their light square bishop is still going to be pinning down this knight. It's not under any pressure right now to move, so they may just continue to develop as they normally would. Now, after knight to c3, black has a couple options. One would just be to force the action. Say, I don't like being pinned down right here. I'm going to play pawn to a6. We already know if they take the knight, we're going to recapture with our bishop. But if they come back, we already know it's going to be a mistake if they come back to a4. More than likely, they're going to retreat, and that's going to be completely fine. Another option would be, instead of playing pawn to a6, just go ahead and play knight to f6. Now, if they decide to, castle on the king side, I'd play pawn to g6, get ready to fianchetto to the king side of the board. Now, if they decide from here to go ahead and take the knight, we're still going to take with our bishop. Even though our knight could take, we're still going to be taking with our bishop. Now, if we come back, they may not play knight to c3. They could try something else. Castle on the king side, very logical move. You still have the same options. You could play that pawn to a6 and force the action, or you could play knight to f6. I'm generally going to be playing the knight to f6 unless I'm playing someone that I actually think is going to make a mistake and play bishop back here to a4, and I can get some material. I'm more interested in getting king safety, pawn to g6, fianchetto my bishop here to g7, castle on the king side, and the queen side of the board tends to work itself out. The next variation we are going to look at is when black plays bishop to d7. A lot of players like this because it forces the action, where when you play your knight, you're not putting any pressure on white. They can just sit here on b5 as long as they want to, and you have to worry about that piece just being pinned down. Where here it says, yeah, we can exchange our material if you want to, but I'm going to force you to make a decision. If you want to retreat, that's completely fine. Play bishop back here to e2. You've somewhat wasted a move. Now I just can continue to develop my pieces. Knight to f6. Even if they don't want to take this material right here, maybe say queen to e2. Great, you can continue to develop your pieces. You can take the bishop anytime you want to. You do have the choice now instead of just waiting for your opponent to take the piece or not. So it doesn't really matter where they go. Even knight to c3, I'm playing knight to f6 as well. Most of the time, since you are forcing them and they don't want to retreat, they're just going to go ahead and take this bishop here on d7. When they do that, go ahead and take with your queen. Don't take with your knight. Very valuable for you to be able to play knight to c6 in this specific variation. Many times they are going to be getting a piece here to d4 after some exchanges, and knowing that you can play knight to c6, forcing that material to leave, retreat, lose a move in tempo is extremely important. Now, after black recaptures on d7, white has a lot of options, as you can imagine. One of the most common ones would be to push forward with d4, trying to capitalize on the center of the board. When they do this, you're going to capture with your own pawn here. And then they have a few options from here. One of the options would be to castle on the king side. Knowing that they have the knight and the queen both attacking, they may decide not to go ahead and get that material right away. They can if they want to. Many times, though, they will also just take with their queen, knowing that they have this option here. If the queen comes to d4, as we've talked about, knight to c6, forcing the queen to come back here. I'll say queen to d3, knight to f6, simple development move, maybe knight to c3, and then I'm playing pawn to g6. Now if we come back, maybe it's not knight to c3, maybe it's castle on the king side. I'm still playing pawn to g6. The one slight variation which would be different is instead of those moves, if they played bishop down here to g5, I'm no longer playing pawn to g6. Hopefully you can see that this would be a bad option. Bishop takes here, pawn captures, and you can see not only a double pawn, not necessarily the worst thing to have double pawns if you have support next to it, but now there is an isolated pawn here on d6. Not the position that black is going for. So most of the time you're going to be playing pawn to g6, but do look out for white coming down and playing bishop down to g5. Now instead of d4, they may try something like knight to c3, and I consider this more of a no pressure move. Where d4, it's putting pressure on the center of the board, it's attacking our material. Knight to c3 is a simple development move, and it's allowing us to do what we want. And when I see this type of move, I'm looking to play something like pawn to g6. Fianchetto on the king side of the board, that's going to be a constant theme throughout. Getting our bishop here to g7 as quickly as possible, and then knight to f6 at some point. And those moves may vary a little bit. Sometimes you're going to be playing knight to f6 first, depending on where your opponent goes, because you may want to use that as an attack. Maybe you're going to be taking here on e4 depending on where they're going, but many times I'm looking for the pawn to g6. From here, if they decide pawn to d4, you can take, their queen can capture, and then knight to f6. You know, now maybe the knight comes down to d5, attacking our knight. I'm playing bishop to g7. Maybe the bishop comes down. Now I'm castling on the king side. Maybe instead of the knight coming down here to d5, maybe they first come down to g5. I'm still, at this point, thinking about coming up to bishop here to g7, but first I'm going to have the in-between move of knight to c6, forcing the queen to move, and at that point I can bring my bishop here to g7. So always be thinking about, if the queen is here on d4, how you can get your knight up here to c6, force the queen back. Another option you may see is pawn to c4. And from here, I'm usually just playing pawn to g6, getting ready to fianchetto to the king side of the board. Now from here, if they push in the center of the board, because that's what they're trying to do, saying, yeah, you're not trying to defend too much in the center, I'm going to push forward, I'm going to play knight to f6. This pawn on d6 is doing a good job of stopping white pushing forward in the board, but I'm not ready to push forward with this pawn on e5. You have a backwards pawn here on d6. It is very difficult to defend this. You want to get your bishop here on g7, so you don't want this tying down to this pawn right here on d6, and you want a very active queen if you can. So I don't like to commit right away with this e-pawn. I like to wait for that. Fianchetto on the king side of the board, maybe castle, bring my rook over here to e8 to protect the pawn, and then push if I want to. Now from here, if they decide to go ahead and take material, so let's say pawn takes on c5, I wouldn't take with this own pawn. I'm always trying to hold on to the center pawns. I would first take the pawn up here on e4. And then usually the queen's going to get involved attacking this, because if the pawn were to take right here, the knight could come back. It's also attacking the pawn here on c5. So this knight on e4 really allows us to dictate how we take back without compromising our pawn structure. But if the queen comes down, we can just bring our knight back here to f6 and things are completely fine, and white no longer has any central pawns. Now, if instead of the pawn to c4, if they just do something like king castle on the king side, similar to when knight came to c3, I think of this as a no pressure move, and I'm playing pawn to g6. So always be thinking about, are they putting pressure on me? And if not, go ahead and start to fianchetto on the king side of the board. The last variation we are going to look at is when the knight comes to c6. This is my preferred variation for black. I know a lot of people have their own opinions on how they like to play, but for me, knight to c6 is my go-to move if I'm playing the Sicilian defense and someone responds with the Moscow variation. Because honestly, I don't care if they take my knight on c6. Yes, I am going to have double pawns on the c-file, but this controls a very important square here on d5. And it's going to be easy long term to get rid of this double pawn, but it gets rid of their bishop pair right away. Now it's very easy for me to get my light square bishop involved into the action because this pawn here on b7 is not there. So very quick, rapid development for black. I can get my queen here to c7 very quickly to control the dark squares in the center, and all of a sudden white doesn't have a ton of material involved into the game. They've moved their bishop a couple moves and then it's no longer on the board. So I'm okay with this variation. Now from here, white has lots of moves they could do. Same thing, could play pawn to d4 in the center. I'm going to go ahead and take with my pawn. I'm always looking for opportunities to get rid of the double pawns here on the c-file, and usually if I can take a pawn that was on the c-file and take a center pawn from white, that is what I'm going to be doing. So I'll be looking at that option for sure, and then later if I want to get knight to f6, I think that's going to be completely fine as well. Now if they decide to go ahead and take knight takes on d4, then you have some options here, but you can push forward with pawn to e5, and I think that's completely fine. If they decide to come down here and play queen to c6, because we're almost baiting them to do this, then you can play queen to b6, and the knight is going to fall, and black is going to be up material. And many times they look at this and they feel like, oh, but it looks like a free pawn here that they can take. Actually, it's not. You are going to gain material in that position. Now, instead of pawn to d4, maybe they decide to castle on the king side. I'm playing queen to c7 in this spot. You want to keep the door open for the light square bishop to get involved into the action. This pawn on c6, just as a spoiler alert, if they're not going to allow you to play something like pawn to d4 and exchange material and get rid of the double pawns, this pawn on c6 does need some attention. Your opponent can attack this later on to the game, so making sure that you can defend this with the queen, as well as these dark squares in the center of the board. Many times there is going to be a lot of pressure building up right here, so having another layer of protection from this queen is going to be crucial. Now, another thing you could see instead of castle on the king side is pawn to d3, solidifying the pawn chain. I'm playing the same thing, queen to c7. Now maybe knight to c3, I'm playing knight to f6, castle on the king side, I'm playing pawn to g6, getting ready to fianchetto to the king side of the board. Now they may decide, I'm not even going to take that knight here on c6, although that is the more common move, but they may recognize that they don't want to give up their bishop here. They could play something, pawn to d4. If they want to, that's fine. We could take right here, and then bishop to d7. This is great because now if they ever want to take the knight, it's not pinning down our king anymore. Then we can just recapture with our bishop. We have a very active square for our bishop at that point. Completely fine for black. If they play more of a no pressure move, pawn to d3, As you could probably guess, I'm playing pawn to g6, and then at some point I'm going to play bishop here to d7, but I do want to go ahead and fianchetto my bishop here to g7 because I'm not too concerned about them taking my knight. I can easily recapture here at pawn to c6 with my pawn. So that's an overview of the Moscow variation. Try out the different options, knight to c6, knight to d7, or even bishop to d7. See what you like, but hopefully this was a good intro overview, give you some things to think about if you like to play the Sicilian defense and your opponent's ever played bishop to b5 and you just did not know where to move. So thank you guys for watching. If you have any other suggestions on openings or variations that you would like to see, feel free to email me at thechesswebsite@gmail.com. Thanks again. I'll see you guys in the next video. Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com.